Welcome to the nuts and bolts of business valuation in family law. I'm Dan Bemmel, and along with April Zonis, I'm co-chair of the Beverly Hills Bar Association's Family Law section. Our section is sponsored by White, Zuckerman, Warsofsky, Luna, and Hunt. White, Zuckerman, Warsofsky, Luna, and Hunt provides a wide variety of resources to complete almost any project, large or small. They also provide traditional accounting and tax practice services. We invite you to contact them to discuss your specific accounting needs and learn how they can be of service to you. We have so many great programs coming up, so please mark your calendars and register now if you haven't already. October 3rd, when bankruptcy is filed during divorce. October 14th, a fireside chat with Judge Kaufman and new family law judges. October 23rd, parenting plan assessments, a LA County practice overview, also with Judge Kaufman. November 1st is our annual family law symposium. This year is called Order in the Court, Tactics for Addressing Bad Faith and Incivility. November 5th, we'll have State of Department 2, one of our annual in-person flagship events. And November 13th, Spotting and Managing SLAP Issues in Family Law. Other exciting programs are on the calendar and in the works, and you're all welcome at our section meetings on the third Wednesday of the month. We plan events, hear directly from Judge Kaufman and other bench officers, brainstorm on cases, and have lots and lots of fun. Okay, so now let's get to the program. I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. Katie Pandolfini is an associate at Blank Rome, LLP, focusing on matrimonial and family law. With a unique background in law and finance, she specializes in representing high net worth clients in complex matters involving asset tracing, business valuation, high-end lifestyle issues, and more. Katie is a certified divorce financial analyst and has completed training in mediation and collaborative law. John Del Grego is a managing director in the Valuation and Litigation Support Services Group at CBIZ Inc. Mr. Del Grego specializes in valuations of closely held businesses and business interests for matrimonial litigation, collaborative and non-adversarial divorce, and estate and gift tax matters. He also performs valuation services for business damages, buy-sell agreements, shareholder litigation, buying and selling businesses, and employee stock ownership plans. Thank you both for putting this together and spending time with us today. Really excited to watch the program, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, so if we can get the slides up on the screen. Okay, John, so what are we doing today?
So today we are talking about one of my favorite topics of all time is valuation. The other's music, but we're gonna talk about valuation here today. So let's go to the next slide. I think we have a preview. Those are pretty mugs. Okay, there we go.
Okay, so I think the top 4 takeaways that we're going to do today is help our audience understand the various standards of value, learn the basic principles of business valuation and the different approaches, recognize various financial statement adjustments, and identify common problems in valuation reports. And along the way, hopefully it's going to be fun and very exciting, as John promised.
Oh, it'll be fun.
All right, next slide. Okay, so these are the 3 different parts. We're going to start off with what is value. All right, next slide. Keep going, next slide. There we go.
Here we go. All right, let me jump in. So we're talking about business valuation. So let's understand the concept of value first and foremost. So value is 2 things. Value is made up of the perception, and it's written here, but it's important. This is everything you want to know about valuation right in this slide. It's the perception of future benefits and the risk of receiving those benefits. So in a business valuation, those future benefits are cash flow, basically. It's money. So value is 2 things. I'm going to keep hitting this because this is everything we want to know about valuation. It's 2 things. It's future benefits. How much money am I going to get from this business? And what are the risks of me getting those benefits? So that's what we do in evaluation. figure out the future cash flow, figure out the risks of getting those cash flows. So cash flow and risk. Now, some of the things we have to consider in evaluation is sort of highlighted in these three little bullet points on the bottom. Value to whom? Value for what purpose? And value when? Because believe it or not, value changes depending on who's buying something, right? So everybody's perception of future benefits could be different. And because that perception of future benefits is different, value could be different. So in evaluation, we want to identify its value to whom so we know how we're going to value this thing. What is the purpose? So we could have the same business if we're valuing it for estate and gift purposes, or valuing it for a divorce, or valuing it for a sale. Those could be three separate and different values. So we want to make sure we dial in on the purpose, who the buyer is, what is the purpose, and when. Because when is also, like, you think about your stock portfolio, your stock prices change on a daily basis. Your business value also changes on, not so much, it's not as volatile, but it does change on a regular basis as well. And so we want to know the valuation date. When are we valuing it? Who's buying it? And what is the purpose of the valuation? So those are the critical pieces of any business valuation.
All right, next slide.
All right, so what we do, we work in this world of hypothetics, right? So if we're valuing a business that's actually being sold, we're going to let the market come to us, give us a price, pay the price, and then we know what the value is worth. We don't what the business is worth. We don't do that here. So as valuation people, we have a lot of assumptions that we have to live off of. And the two most critical are this premise of value and the standard of value. So the premise, we can go to the next slide. The premise of value is, will the business be sold or will the business be liquidated? So what we hear all the time in divorce cases is we go to value the business owner says, you know what, my business is not worth anything because I'm just going to shut it down and no longer work. Therefore, it has no value. Yes, you could do that. But the assumption or the premise that we work under as valuation experts in a divorce is that it is a going concern. It will continue on into the future. That is the first premise. We could also assume it might be liquidated. That's a different value. That's a different premise. In divorce cases, it's typically this going concern premise that the business will continue on, whether or not you decide you want to shut it down. I mean, that's your decision as part of the divorce, but the value of the business is under the assumption that it will be sold.
When are you going to use a liquidation value in a divorce case?
We may use a liquidation value in situations when the profits of the company or the cash flow of the company doesn't create value. In other words, the thing is worth more dead than alive. And that actually, some businesses are really just there to pay the owner a salary. And therefore, it doesn't have any really transactional value. It has enough to pay compensation. So therefore, it's only worth the value of its assets. So we may consider a liquidation value when the cash flow is not significant enough to use a going concern. But we go into a business saying, look, this business is going to continue on.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide.
If Katie and I knew how to use technology, we would be forwarding these ourselves, but we don't know what we're doing. We're just vamping here. So, all right, here is where we get really crazy. This standard of value is the hypothetical conditions that we operate under to value a business. So there are a lot of these different standards of value. We're going to get into it a little bit, but there's fair market value, fair value, investment value. All of these different standards of value tell us how we should value the business, what hypothetical assumptions we use to value the business. And each of these could come up again with a different value. Every state has a different standard of value. So let's go to the next slide. The most common standard of value is fair market value, and all the other valuation, all the other values, all the other standards of value are kind of built off fair market value. So fair market value, here's the hypothetical assumption that we live off of. Under fair market value, we assume that there is a sale of the business, between hypothetical willing buyers and hypothetical willing sellers, neither under a compulsion to do the transaction. Nobody's forcing anybody to sell. It's two hypothetical people going to the market, one to buy, one to sell. That's the assumption in fair market value. So, and hypothetical is important because let me give you an example. So I do a lot of work in the music industry, music stores. So, and I'm a musician part-time. So I like music stores. I like guitars. I like drums. I may see a music store and say, I'm willing to pay a lot of money for this music store because I've always dreamed of owning a music store and I love all the inventory. So that's me as John Del Grego looking to pay a premium to buy a cool music store. That music store may have a competitor in the marketplace, Guitar Center by example, who says, you know what, you're a pain in the neck to me. I want to buy you out of the market and I'm going to pay a lot of money to do so. So different motivations create value. We as valuation people can't decide we can't identify all those possible buyers of a business. There could be hundreds of them with hundreds of different values. We rely on this hypothetical willing buyer, willing seller, which essentially says you got a business, it's going to operate essentially the way it's operating now, generating the similar amount of cash flow. What would an investor pay for it? That's fair market value. That's where most of our valuation work hovers. If we go to the next slide, we'll see some
You're just looking for, a rational person, not the person who's going to pay a premium, who's, it's fact specific.
That's exactly right. It's not fact specific because everybody has their own motivation to buy. We don't identify those because we can't. It's exactly like you said. It's actually an investment buy. Like if an investor came in and said, I want this company, how much cash flow? What's my future benefit? How much cash flow is this company as it's operating going to put in my pocket? That's how we look at it. And these are some of the concepts I just sort of went through: the hypothetical willing buyer, willing seller, so forth. It's also a cash price. So we know from experience in buying and selling businesses in my world that it's not always a cash price in a transaction. Sometimes there's an earnout, right? So the value is, here's $1,000 and I'll pay you 25% of revenues going forward. Again, that's kind of speculation. We have to zero this in on what is the cash price for this business. So that's kind of important as well. Let's go to the next slide. So here are some other standards of value: fair investment value to the holder. Let's talk about California because that's where we are, right? So California is a little bit tricky. California is almost all of these. So California is a fair value state, but they also use investment value. They also use marital value. I think they also use value to the holder, all meaning the same thing essentially, though. And this is where it gets tricky because fair value in some states doesn't mean the same thing as it does in other states. But what fair value means is we're not considering discounts. We'll talk about discounts in a little bit. Discounts are tricky, but when I value a company in this hypothetical world, I know what we're assuming under fair market value is we're taking that interest, we're taking it to the marketplace, and the marketplace is going to look at it and say, well, I'm not going to pay you full value for this because you don't have control of the operations. If I want to sell in a year, it's going to take me a long time to do it because it's a private company. And we see that in the marketplace, privately held companies and privately held interests are discounted, and sometimes they're discounted pretty heavily. We can use those discounts in fair market value. In fair value, we typically don't consider discounts. We basically just say, hey, this business is kicking out this amount of cash flow. What is that cash flow worth? So no discounts typically in fair value in California, although I think there's also times when fair market value is used. So California is a confusing state. They have a lot of synonymous terms, but traditionally it's a fair value, investment, marital value, all meaning what's the cash flow to this individual business owner and what's it worth?
Okay.
All right. So those are the standards. The standards of value are complicated, but it's really the hypothetical. It's the hypothetical assumptions that we live on that says, here's how we're going to value this. Some critical things here in a divorce situation, the valuation date. So I think I mentioned earlier, value as of when is very important, right? So value changes on not so much on a daily basis for a privately held company, but value does change on a regular basis. So in California, it's date of trial. In a lot of states, it's date of trial. New York is date of separation. So we value a business based on the jurisdictional requirements. So we value it as here in California and Connecticut, where I'm sitting right now, it's date of trial. And so we try to get a value as close to that date as possible. But, it could also be an agreed upon date. But it gets tricky in valuation with a valuation date, especially if you have a agreed upon valuation date. Let's say we've agreed that July 31st, 2025 is our valuation date. That makes things easy for me because I know the valuation date. It's not a moving target for the date of trial, which may not even been scheduled yet, or could be postponed. I got to continue to update valuations. We have an agreed upon date, July 31st. We're sitting here on October 1st. I can only rely on what's known or knowable as of the valuation date in my valuation date. So in my valuation. So if there is a value, if I value this as of July 31st and something happened that materially affects the business in September, I have to go back to July 31st and figure out if that information was known or knowable. If it was known or knowable back in July, I could incorporate it into my valuation. If it's not known or knowable, I have to ignore it, even though it happened. So that agreed upon date and that set valuation date is sometimes easier, sometimes it's harder, and sometimes it brings in a lot of issues. But the valuation date is very important, and we can only consider what's known and knowable as of that date.
So for valuations as of the date of trial, I mean, how often do you actually have statements, up to the date of trial to actually perform your valuation? We know this takes a long time.
Yeah, great question. Never. I shouldn't say never, but what typically happens? Yeah, I mean, what typically happens is there's a lag. There's a few months lag between the valuation and the trial. So if we're all working on the same page, there's usually two experts in every engagement. Hopefully what we get to do is say, look, we got trial, it's coming in a certain date. Let's at least let the experts have information through the same date, right? Because you want to compare apples and apples. So you gotta pick a valuation date that's as close to trial as possible. Then, from the time of your valuation to the date of trial, the best we can do is see if anything has happened that would materially change our valuation, in which case we may have to update it, the night of. But if nothing material has changed during that time period, we can usually testify that this is the value as of, privately held companies aren't as volatile as publicly traded stocks. So if we're a few months out in our valuation date to trial, chances are that is a pretty good valuation. But yeah, it can get tricky. As you get postponements and deferrals, the further it gets out from the valuation date, the less reliable it becomes. And it gets expensive updating. So you kind of want to narrow that gap between valuation date and trial date.
All right, let's move on. Next slide. Thanks. Okay.
So this is just an important concept. I'll tell you in a second why I put it here. Value is determined. That's what I do. I figure out the value of a company. Price is negotiated. And so price and value may be the same, but not necessarily. And this is an important concept. When I value a company, the case settles, and a year later it sells for 3 times what I said it was worth. And then they come back and say, Del Grego, you screwed up, you were wrong. And I say, I'm never wrong. So price is negotiated. What typically happens in those types of situations is a buyer came in, a strategic buyer came in and paid a premium. We need to reconcile that. We will look at it and reconcile it, but we value it based on these hypothetical situations, which is mandated by fair market value standards, and then an investment buyer comes in or strategic buyer comes in and pays whatever the heck they wanted to pay. So the price and the value don't always line up, and in most cases they don't. So this is not unusual for things like that to happen. But it's understand, and even when I'm valuing companies for the purpose of management planning, I'll tell the person I'm working with, like, here's what this cash flow is worth to you. This is not what I'm telling you to sell the business for, right? This is what it's worth in your hands, but you're to sell a business, go out and get a premium for it and find the right buyer who's going to pay that premium. That's two different things. Value is value, value is calculated, price is negotiated.
When are price and value the same?
Well,
Yes.
they could be the same if we're using price as value, which happens, right? So sometimes we might go into a divorce where there's a letter of intent to sell the business, right? So we work in this world of hypothetics based on the fact that we're not actually selling the business, but we want to know what it's worth. So we come up with a price. But if they've already in the negotiation of saying, we're selling the business, we've got a letter of intent, we're negotiating. So price and value for purposes of the divorce could be the same if that's where they are in that particular stage. Or if you're selling it to non-strategic buyers, right? So if I did a valuation and they used it for purposes of negotiating a settlement and they turned around, I'm just going to sell it to my employees or sell it to somebody, and there's no strategic anything, no strategy with that, value and price could be the same.
Okay. All right, next slide.
All right,
Okay.
what is a business valuation? What do I do?
Yeah.
Go to the next one. So when we look at a business valuation, we actually look at four things. I missed one here, but it's financial, operational, economics, and industry. Those are kind of the four things we look at. The financial side, why are we analyzing financial statements? Because we want to understand the cash flow, right? So value is cash flow and risk. I'm going to keep coming back to that concept. So the financials tell us what the cash flow of the business is. How do we measure risk? Economic. We look at the economy. How does the economy going to affect the business and the cash flow? We look at the industry. How does the industry affect the cash flow to the business? If we forget the industry, if we forget the economy and just focus on the cash flow, we've missed the risk, right? So, I'll give you an example. We're valuing a compact disc manufacturer in 1995 banging out Spice Girl CDs, right? So they're making oodles of money banging out these compact discs music, right? So if all we looked at is the financials and said, okay, I'm going to pay a lot of money for this manufacturing company because look how much money it's making. If I forget the industry piece of that, which says in 2000, digital music is going to replace compact discs. I mean, I've completely overvalued the business. I've got to understand the risk. I've got to research the risk. So you could have profits that may not continue to the future. So it's cash flow and risk. So those are the things we really need to hone in on when we're doing evaluation.
Okay, next slide.
All right, so here are the basic steps. This is like out of a textbook, but figure out what the engagement is. And I got to meet with the attorneys. What am I doing here for you? Am I doing a valuation? Look, is it fair value? Is it fair market value? I do a lot of work. I'm on the East Coast right now. I do a lot of work in Massachusetts, also a fair value case, but state. But I'm quite often asked to do fair market value because it's not statutory, it's case driven, and it's equitable distribution. So what makes the most sense in the engagement? So what am I doing? What standard of value am I applying? I'm gathering the data, analyzing it, getting my conclusion, writing a report, maybe, or a disclosure. But those are the basic steps. So let's go to the next. We'll talk about the data that we rely upon.
Before we get there,
yeah.
For let's say that you are asked to do, evaluation. When do you, for the attorneys in the audience, when do you think that you're better off having a neutral, you're better off having your own expert? What's sort of your rules of thumb on that?
It depends on the attorneys. So I do a lot of work as a neutral. And I explained to both sides that, look, whether I'm a neutral or work for one side or the other, I make a living being an independent valuation expert. Doesn't matter who hires me, right? So I'm getting hired for my independent opinion. So it doesn't matter what side I'm working for. As a neutral, I think I have a better chance of getting all the information I need, as opposed to working on one side or the other, where sometimes the information is limited. So there's always, going through channels to get everything you need, having two experts, competing experts, and we could talk about why there's differentials. But when you have two experts, they're never going to come up with the same answer. It doesn't mean one's right or one's wrong. It means they've had, if they're both qualified, it means they're getting different information and interpreting it differently because they're only hearing maybe one side of the story. As a neutral, if you can get access to both sides and get all the documents and do all the work you need to do, I think it's more efficient. But you've got to have the right set of attorneys that will agree to that because, I do a lot of work in New York where the courts hire the neutral and both sides always hire their own. And there's always three experts in every case because nobody trusts anybody. So you got to trust your expert and you got to have the right set of attorneys. It's more efficient, but everybody's got to be on the same page with it.
All right, let's keep going.
All right, so let's go back one. Thanks. So when I start a valuation engagement, I send out a 2 or 3 page request for what I need. I've been doing this for so long. You never use the word need because you guys will cross-examine and say you needed that, you didn't get it, so therefore your opinion is not valid.
You wanted it.
This is the list. I set out a list of things that I want in a valuation. So, and it's 25, 30, 40 things. Of those, there's 6 things here that I will want to see in every valuation. And they're basic stuff. And I got to tell you, I still get pushback on some of the basic stuff, and it costs a lot of time and money. And I will get these documents eventually. So, because anyway, the 6 things we're looking at are financial statements, tax returns, general ledgers, forecasts, employees. It's all right here. But why? So when we're doing evaluation, cash flow and risk, right? So I want to see the historical operations of the company to figure out what kind of profits and cash flow this thing is generating so I can figure out future cash flows. That's coming from the financial statements. It's coming from the tax returns. And the general ledgers are actually giving me a deep dive into the numbers on the financial statements and tax returns. So these are just the basic documents that I'm looking for. Forecasts are exactly that. If the company is preparing budgets and forecastings, they're predicting what their future cash flow is. I absolutely want to see that so I don't have to spend as much time on it. I want to know what they think their cash flow is. Employee W-2s are important for a number of reasons, one of which is I want to see if there's anybody on the payroll that shouldn't be on the payroll, that's not working there, family members, boyfriends, girlfriends, whatever it may be. I also want to know their pay structure because as we're going to talk about in a bit when we get to adjustments, when it gets to the point when I want to understand what the owner should be earning, I've got to see what everybody else is being paid in the organization, see what their pay structure is. And I always get a lot of pushback on employee W-2s because they're not part of this litigation, they're not part of this whole thing, and we're not going to send them to you. But I don't care about names and social security numbers, but I want to see how top level management people are being paid. So, and then we got the bank statements and credit cards, which again, that's a forensic side of it. And there's forensics in most valuations. When I get a tax return, what's the motivation of a tax return? It's to not pay taxes, right? So very few tax returns are showing true profitability. Not that anybody's hiding things or doing anything that they're not supposed to be doing, but the tax laws allow you to take a lot of deductions that normally you wouldn't need or take if you're just looking at true and optimal cash flow for evaluation purposes. But we also know that privately held companies, some owners use their privately held company as a checkbook, so as their own personal checkbook. So there is an element of forensics where we use the general ledgers, the bank statements, and credit card statements to kind of vet out things that are not necessary to the business operations. And so these are some critical documents that we rely upon and really should get on a regular basis. And your expert, when you're hired, then should get on a regular basis.
And how far back do you usually request these records?
So 5 years is the sort of rule of thumb that every valuation analyst will ask for. And is it written in stone? It's not written in stone. Sometimes we get 2 years, 3 years. But the reason we want to go back as far as possible. And the reason is we're looking for two things. We're looking for trends over time. Like if a company is growing, in the last 2 years, well, is that an anomaly or has that been growing for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years? So the further back we can go, the better look we can, the more we can look back, the better we can understand what's happening with the company. But 5 years seems to give us a long enough economic cycle where we can see the highs and the lows. That's really what we're trying to see. And if we have 5 years and everything is straight line, that gives us comfort that the company is kind of stabilized. If we see a lot of volatility, maybe we go back further. Don't know. But 5 years is sort of the norm, especially with one of those years right now being like 2020, 2021. So with COVID, which changed a lot of things for businesses, sometimes we go back even further. I might want to see 18, 19, throw out 2021, look at 22, 23, 24. But no rule of thumb, but you'll typically see 5 years for all of this stuff.
Okay. All right, next slide.
Just some additional stuff. I mean, the important thing here, it's part of the valuation process. And I said operational, we consider operations. We want to have a site visit and a management interview. Not always a site visit, service business. I don't care you're working out of your house. I don't need to come there. But we want to have a management interview and we're going to request it. Sometimes it's denied. It shouldn't be denied. If you've got the business owner, let your client talk to the valuation expert. I mean, again, we're trying to get data. We're trying to learn as much as possible about a business. If all we are hearing is information from the out spouse, the non-working spouse, that information is going to be tainted. It's going to be tainted because maybe they don't have intimate knowledge of the operations, or they're just telling you one side of the story. I want to hear all sides of the story. I want to get to the right place. And the only way to do that is to talk to the people who actually run the business. I start with the business owner, but I may ask to talk to other people who are knowledgeable about the operations. I want to know what makes it tick. Again, how do they create revenue? And again, what are the risks of continuing to generate that revenue? It's cash flow and risk. I'll continue to say it, but those are the two components of valuation. That's what we do.
Right. And why do you care about other employees' salaries if you only have a single business owner? I see that's on here.
So if you've got a single business owner but employees, and we'll talk about adjustments in a second, but business owners can take out whatever they want out of their business. So if they take all their profits out of the business and call it salary, then there's no cash left over, and in theory, there's no value. That's not necessarily true. What we do is we look at the business, we look at the business owner, we figure out the roles of the business owner, and then we say, okay, based on what this individual does, he should be paid X. Now, what's that X? How do we figure out that X? Well, we go to compensation experts, we go to benchmarking databases, or we look at people within the organization. So if I know that the president of the company is making a certain dollar amount and this owner is acting as the CEO, I'm going to assume, well, he's got to be making at least more than his president because he's doing more than his president. So I can use those individuals as a benchmark to figure out what the owner should be making.
Okay. All right, next slide.
All right. Data. This is where we spend a lot of time. So when I ask for financial statements and tax returns, if all I get are tax returns, and I said this earlier, tax returns have a specific motivation of not paying taxes. So what I'm looking for as a valuation person is how much can an investor, me as an investor, I'll put myself in investor shoes, how much can I expect to get out of this business? What kind of cash flow is it generating on kind of this optimal basis, right? If I stripped out all the nonsense, if all I have is a tax return, I've got to do some work to get to the true cash flows of the business. But there's also financial statements that I get. Are those more reliable? Maybe. you have this issue of cash basis tax returns versus accrual basis. I won't get into the accounting nonsense, but there's different accounting for different types of financial documents. So typically we see on the financial statement side, a financial statement is something that shows your total revenue and your expenses to get to your profit. That's a typical financial statement. There's really four kinds. There's the kind that are produced internally, which we've got to spend a whole bunch of time on to figure out if they're accurate. Then there's the kind we get from the company's accountants, and they're either compiled, reviewed, or audited. And compiled is nothing more than taking the internals, doing no work to them, and just sorting them and putting in a pretty little format and handing them back, right? So you see a compiled financial statement from an accountant, you don't put a lot of credibility into it. I'm not going to say credibility. There hasn't been a whole lot of oversight to it. Reviewed and audited, the accountants actually come in and they do some analytical work to say, are the numbers that the company has given me, are they accurate? And the audit is the highest level. You get an audited financial statement. These auditors have spent a lot of time vetting these numbers to make sure they're right. So less forensics is necessary typically, and I say typically, on audited financial statements than an in-house, internally prepared. So it's the level of work based on the type of financial information that we're relying upon.
Okay, so compiled, we should be a little bit wary, but audited a little bit less.
Correct. Yeah, compiled is nothing more than they took the internal financial statements and pretty them up, basically.
Okay. Next slide.
All right. Here's where all of the fun begins. So we have all these financial statements, tax returns, and we lay them all out over 5 years or 3 years or however long we have them. And now we got to figure out, is the cash flow I'm looking at the real cash flow of the business? And there's three categories that we look for when we're doing this analysis. The first is, are there any expenses or even income items? Are there any items in this financial statements that I'm looking for that will not recur? Are there one-time expenses? Is there a one-time income influx? The reason I want to know that is because during the valuation process, I'm using these historical financial statements and historical results as a proxy for that future cash flow benefit we were talking about. So it's future income and risk. That future income is based, in some instances, off historical performances. So I want to make sure that historical results are properly stated, meaning I'm cleaning up those results for things that I don't expect will recur into the future. I want a clean set of historical adjusted financial statements. So the first is these non-recurring items. The second, I'm looking for assets and liabilities that are not business related. When I value a business, the value is the value of all the company's assets and liabilities, unless they're not contributing to the revenues of the company. Like I've got an airplane, a luxury vehicle or boat. I've got some investment land. I've got some things that aren't necessarily part of business operations. They're just dumped into the company. I want to identify those, strip those out, value them separately. And then the last one's the most fun, discretionary expenses. We call them discretionary because we don't want anybody to think that there's tax fraud or anything. They're discretionary. They're expenses that a hypothetical investor or buyer may not have to incur to still generate the same level of revenues and profits. So discretionary. Let's go to the next slide.
These are your perks.
Perks or beyond perks. So I think I'll lay out a couple of them if we go to the next slide.
All right, let's go to the next slide.
So these are non-recurring, just some examples, right? So if you had some major improvements in a year, that's going to reduce cash flow, but let's clean that crap out. So, these are just some examples of non-recurring. We can go to the next slide, which is probably some non-operating. There's your autos and whatnot. And so go to the next one. Thanks. So discretionary. So these are the ones that you have the most fun in cross-examination. And these are the ones where when we talk about two experts valuing a company, it's like, wow, you're so far apart. How is that possible? And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but one of the reasons you're so far apart is owner's compensation. So when I own a business, I can pay myself whatever the heck I want. And if I can pay myself whatever the heck I want, then I may show very little profitability and very little value. So value is based on cash flow. If I have very few profits, very little profits in a business, then it's not really worth anything. What we do is we come in, and I think I mentioned this earlier, we look at the owner's comp, we look at their roles, we see how much control they have and how they pay themselves, and then we make an adjustment. If this person's making $1 million a year, but the market says they should only be making $200,000 a year, we adjust their compensation to $200,000 a year. That gives us another $800,000 a year to put to the bottom line. That creates value. So the higher the officer comp, that's adjusted in evaluation, the lower the cash flow, the lower the value. When two experts come in to evaluation, one expert may think this person is so important that they have to make $800,000 a year, or the other expert says, you know what, they're not important at all. They only have to make $200,000 a year. That's a subjective adjustment that has a tremendous impact on value. So owner's comp is one of the biggest adjustments you're going to see us make. Um, the second is these other areas where people always that run businesses take some liberties, right? It's travel, it's entertainment, it's gas for the car, insurance, all the perks, right? But then you got to measure, would those perks still be available to a high-level executive in a business, right? We got to be careful. Not all country club dues and auto leases or automatic add backs unless you've captured it in the total officer compensation. But there's a lot of non-owner executives that have those perks. So you've got to figure out in the context of the company you're valuing if those perks make sense for the owner of the company to pay to an executive, right? So we've got to take a hard look at all of these things, but the forensic side of it is digging through the general ledgers, the bank statements, the credit cards, to find the travel, to find all the other expenses. And that's where we see the biggest discrepancies. If I've got the business owner and I'm seeing a lot of travel and entertainment, and I have a conversation, they tell me how important it is that they do this and entertain their clients and go on these extravagant vacations and all this other kind of stuff, I leave it in. I don't make an adjustment for it. Whereas the other side here is, you know what, I don't believe you need all that. I'm hearing from the out spouse, not owner spouse, that, he or she tags along and it has nothing to do with business. And there's conflicting information that brings you to conflicting valuation results. But rent's another one. It's very common that when you own a business, you own the business. I'm sorry, you own the facility for which you operate from in a separate entity. And that allows me as the business owner to pay above market rent or below market rent. But if I were to buy that business as an investor, I'm going to pay market rent. So we'll make an adjustment to market rent, which means if there's a piece of real estate owned either by the business or by the business owners, it has to be valued. It has to be appraised, because we as valuation experts want that fair market rent number. We want to know what number to dump in there in our valuation.
So it seems like there's a lot of subjectivity as to these adjustments, and that's where the two experts can really differ.
Yeah, I mean, so this is where you spend most of your time on cross-examination. It's, what are the assumptions that went into these adjustments, right? So whenever you're cross-examining an expert, you want to key in on those assumptions. And better, the technique in a cross is not so much saying, hey, Del Grego, you're wrong, because you don't know if I'm right or wrong, because this is my lane you're in. But it's more like, had you used this instead of that, what effect does it have on the result, right? So put in the judge's mind that you could have gone in either direction, you went in this direction, and it had this result. That's kind of how you want to approach the expert, because yes, these are subjective. And if an expert says, it's this and only this, that's problematic. It's never black and white. It's, in my opinion, based on what I've learned from my conversations with, this is what I believe this number should be. But this is where it gets, yeah, it's subjective and it's tricky.
Okay.
Next.
All right, next slide.
All right, how do we do all this? So next slide. So here we go. So we've done all this work so far, right? So we know conceptually, we know our standard of value. We know we've looked at the financial statements. We're trying to predict future cash flow. We've made all our adjustments. Now we've got this clean set of whatever. We've got the profits of the business. We've got the earnings of the business owner. Now we're here. What do we do with it? So there are three approaches to value. And when you're talking to your appraiser or you're cross-examining the other appraiser, you need to consider all three of these in every valuation. Do they all apply in every valuation? No, we don't use all of them all the time, but we have to consider all of these. So there's three approaches. There's an income approach, a market approach, and an asset approach. The income approach is simply figure out the cash flow of the business and use that, the technical way of doing it is you take the cash flow, you divide it by a rate of return, you come up with value. We don't have to get involved with the math of it, but it's cash flow divided by a rate of return, get value. The market approach, very, very similar to, you're selling your house, right? What is my 4-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac in Poughkeepsie, New York worth, right? So I would go to town hall and I'd find other 4-bedroom colonials and I'd see what they were sold for, and I would use that as a proxy for the value of my house. And same thing with a business. If I can find comparable companies that were sold, I would use those sales prices to figure out the price of mine. And then the last approach we have is the asset approach. And the asset approach is simply similar to that liquidation method we were talking about early. The asset approach is the value of your business is worth the value of its assets being, cash, inventory, machinery, less its liabilities. That's the asset approach. It's a simple approach. We don't use it as a primary approach very often, but we consider it, right? Because we think a business should not be worth less than its assets. In other words, if I value a business and I come up with $1,000 for the value of the business, but I look at the value of its cash on the books and its inventory and subtract out its liabilities, and it's $5,000 worth of assets, and I only have $1,000 of value using my other approaches, well, then maybe it is worth the value of the assets. So we do consider the asset approach, but it's not used all that often as a primary approach in evaluation. But your appraiser should always, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Do you look at each approach when you're valuing a business?
Yes. So let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about them a little more in depth, and I'll tell you when and how. Well, let me just. I always get this question after I value a company. It's like, okay, you value the company, you came up with a number, and it's $1 million for the value of the business, but they've got $200,000 of inventory, and I know they have at least $1 million. They got at least $100,000 of machinery. So do we add that to the value? No. When we value a business, the value includes all of the assets, tangible and intangible assets that contribute to the revenues of the company. In other words, that value includes all of that inventory, all of the machines. It includes all of these things, tangible and intangible. And an intangible asset is something you can't touch or feel, like cash and products. You can see all that. But intangibles, like I have a convenience store on a corner of a busy intersection that, because of my location, I make a lot of money with people walking in and out, right? So the intangible asset is location, or maybe it's trade name, or maybe it's reputation, right? So all of those things are captured in the value, all inclusive. What's not captured in the value are those non-operating assets we talked about a little while ago, like the luxury boat or the land, or things that don't contribute to the operations of the company are not included, but the value includes all of the assets of the company. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about the income. So let's go to the next one. There's under the income approach, you're going to see one of two methods most commonly. You're going to see the capitalization method or you're going to see the discounting method. All you need to know about these two methods are the capitalization method takes the historical financial statements, uses that as a proxy of future benefit. Again, it's future benefit and risk. So we use the historical, we come up with some kind of we use an analysis and we say these historical results should repeat into the future and we come up with value. Discounting, we project future cash flow. We don't ignore technically, but we don't use historical results. We actually use a projection. Next year, they're going to do X. The year after that, they're going to do Y. The year after that, they're going to do something. So we use a projection, a little harder to use. A lot of people stay away from the discounting method, especially in litigation, because it's a little more speculative with the crystal ball. I think I'm going to do this in 26. I'm going to do that in 27. It's hard to project future income. A lot of people rely on this capitalization method, which says, look, based on the last 5 years, here's the average cash flow over the last 5 years. Let's just say that's going to happen into the future. So 2 different methods. Those are the most common ones you'll see.
When are you going to see the discounting method? Like, what's an example of a business where that would be important?
So the discounting method you would want to use where you have a business that's either a startup business where it has no history and you can't use the other method, or something significantly is expected to change. So if we've got a situation where, hey, and I actually just had this in a valuation where they valued the company and then a specific event happened. They valued it as of April, but then a specific event happened in March that dramatically changed the revenues of this business. It increased it. They had a positive review. It was a restaurant. They had a positive review that kicked them to another level. So the capitalization method, the historical, meant nothing because this put them in another plane. So we actually had to create projections to capture that positive review that stemmed a whole lot of growth. So when we expect something to be dramatically different, we go to this discounting method.
Okay. Next slide.
Pros and cons. We use this in almost every single engagement because it is company specific. Here are the cash flows of the business, and based on the cash flow of the business, here's what it's worth. So that's really the advantage of this approach. So let's go to the next one, which will be the market approach. Love the concept of the market approach. Hey, my 4-bedroom colonial on the end of the cul-de-sac sold for $500,000. So that means other 4-bedroom colonials on the street are also worth $500,000. Easy. Not so easy in the valuation world. I've got an engineering firm in New Haven, Connecticut, and it's what's it worth? Okay, let me go find another engineering firm in New Haven, Connecticut that sold recently. Guess what? I'm probably not going to find it. So let me expand that engineering firm outside of New Haven into New England, and I still don't have enough transactions. So let me expand it nationally. Cool. Now I got a bunch of stuff, but they're all different sizes. They're all different. And remember what I said earlier, these are actual sales of businesses. What happens in actual sales of businesses? You have different motivations, different people. So people are buying certain businesses for a particular reason. So you've got multiples and values all over the place that you've got to kind of dissect. So the market approach is very tricky. Conceptually, it's very easy, but it's very tricky to implement. So great area of cross-examination if your expert or the opposing expert has used the market approach. Because let's go to the next slide, because there's 2. So there's public company and merger and acquisition. So if I'm using a market approach, I could actually find, I don't know if I can, but if there's publicly traded companies in the same industry as my company, I could see what they're trading for because it's available data, right? I can go to Yahoo and I could see what their price is. The problem is those are billion-dollar companies. And a lot of those billion-dollar companies have multiple arms of operations. So unless you have a really, really, really large company you're valuing, we don't typically see the use of the guideline public company. What we see more often is this merger and acquisition method, which is exactly what I was talking about before. We find sales of comparable businesses in the same industry, hopefully the same with the same level of revenues in the same geographic location, and try to match it up. It's very hard to do. So if one, if an expert is using this, you got to kind of dive into the details of, all right, you've used these dozen transactions. Your business is $1 million business, but one of the transactions is a $10 million business. How is that comparable? Like dig in, you got to dig into where's the comparability of these transactions to your subject company to see if it's really a match, So it's a hard method to use. I use it as a test of reasonableness. I use it when I have a volume of data. Like if I went to a database and had 75 transactions and they all hovered around 1 times revenue, meaning the revenues were $1 million and it sold for $1 million, I can say, okay, these things traded $1 million. But you don't see that too often.
Okay.
And last, we got the asset approach, which is
Go to the next slide.
the next slide is simply the asset approach.
Talked about the pros and
let's go to the
cons.
next.
We can keep going.
And the asset approach is basic, right? This is the floor value of any business. It's its assets minus its liabilities. And if we can't get value using the other two, then it's worth at least this. So kind of a simple approach.
Okay.
Rules of thumb.
We love rules of thumb.
Yeah, right. Everybody loves rules of thumb. I get called on it all the time. Hey, what are accounting firms trade at? Okay, I can give you a range, but let's not lock into it, right? So rules of thumb are exactly that. They're like, you know what? These businesses try to sell for 5 times cash flow. Okay, so I'm going to put 5 times cash flow. Now I have an idea what this thing's worth. Can I testify to it as an expert? No, I'm not testifying to a rule of thumb. I could give you some ideas of, based on all the data I've ever seen, this is kind of this is the range of value, but you never want to rely on a rule of thumb. It gives you a ballpark and only a ballpark.
So John, looks like we have a question from the audience.
Good.
Not to interrupt you, but let's do it. So how do you treat retained earnings in valuing a business?
Yeah, good question. So retained earnings is really the sum or the product of the product. It's been so long since I've been in math class. It's your assets minus your liabilities is your retained earnings. So it's your net assets. So the retained earnings of a business is really the minimum that it's worth. So retained earnings is really everything that you've left in the business, which is all the assets minus its liabilities. So it's retained earnings is the net asset of a company. The net asset of the company is looked at as the floor value for the business. It's essentially how we look at it. All right.
Are you done with the slide? Should we go to the next one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bona fide offers to buy. These are fun. So, we always ask when we're valuing a company, interviewing management, we're, like I said earlier, we're working in this world of hypothetics. What is this thing worth if it were to be sold? But I will ask, have you ever had any offers? Because I want to know, especially now, like if I'm valuing a company as of today and you've got an offer on the table, well, that's value, right? You asked earlier, Katie, when's value and price the same? It could be the same. If you've got an offer on the table, somebody's going to buy your actual business that we're trying to value. Well, that's the value. The reason we're in this world of hypothetics is because you don't have anybody buying the business. So we have to fall in line with these assumptions. But if you've got somebody who wants to buy your business, this could be the value of the business. If it's a true offer, there's a lot of moving parts to it, but we want to absolutely know if there has been any offers or there are any offers on the table. We need to consider those if they exist.
I see we're running out of time. Or actually we're even out of time. So let's go to the next slide.
All right.
Let's try to wrap up.
Yeah. So discounts, all we need to know about for discounts is fair market value uses discounts. I value a business, it's $1 million. You own 10% of that million dollar value, so that's $100,000. Is that your value? Not necessarily. Under fair market value, we assume that 10% interest is going to be taken to the market. And the market's going to say, I ain't paying you $100,000 off $1 million value because I can't control the cash flow. I can't do anything with this. I can't sell it. It's going to take me forever to find a buyer. I'm going to discount this 20, 30, 40%. Those are discounts, lacking control, marketability, and they, I don't want to say arbitrarily, but a lot of states don't love them because they reduce value even though you're going to get all of the cash flow as the business owner. So it's this concept of, if I were to take it to the market, how would the market treat it? But you're not actually taking it to market. So that's what the discount situation is. And fair value doesn't really consider the discounts, and we kind of mentioned that before under those standards.
We've got another question.
Yeah.
All right. So how is the add back percentage for perquisites determined? Is there a standard percentage, or does it vary based on each case?
Yeah, it varies. So it'd be nice if we used a percentage like, hey, 50% of T&E is going to add back. And look, we might do that, but it's really fact specific. I mean, if it's like, I like to go into a case and say, tell me how much personal spending's in this, because I don't want to have to spend all this time on the forensics, right? So maybe we come to an agreement on it. But in other cases, we may do a full spending analysis, a full forensic analysis, lay it all out, figure it out for ourselves, and then maybe through deposition say, tell me about all of these expenses and what they were for. We try to do it quantitatively so we get the actual right answer as opposed to a percentage. I might use a percentage if it's a small case, we're just trying to settle it, we want to come up with a number. Everybody says, yeah, I do have some entertainment. We may use a percentage, but it's really, really fact and case specific.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide.
This is just the discount. We can skip over that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good stuff in here. That's just the math of it. You guys don't want to do math. It's all right. This is like even our last slide, so we can bang this thing out. So here's where we have problems with in evaluation report, what we typically look for, not understanding the business or the industry, right? So we talked about you're the compact disc manufacturer and it's 2000 and you're going to be replaced by digital downloads, right? If your valuation analyst hasn't figured out the risks that are presented to this business, they haven't done their job, right? So we want to understand the business, we want to understand the industry, we want to figure out the risks. The normalization entries are huge, right? You want to make sure that that's the area of cross-examination and critique that you're going to spend your most time on. What normalization, what adjusting entries have been made? And if you miss them, you put in the wrong officer's comp, you miss some perks that you haven't taken out, you're gonna come up with the wrong value. Roles of owners, same thing. If I don't know what the person does, I may not assign the right compensation to them, which means I've overvalued or undervalued the business. Personal goodwill is a whole valuation presentation all of itself, but personal goodwill is, I need to understand how much of the cash flow is generated by the personal knowledge and reputation of the individual, so I can assign the right compensation to that person. And there's a few other here, but I know we're running out of time. But
so before we end, give the audience a couple of tips for cross-examining a business valuation expert.
Yeah, so hone in. So let me think about this. I don't want you to cross-examine me, so I don't want to answer quick.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. Credibility is where you gain all your advantage, right? So if you can impeach credibility, and it doesn't even mean that they're not qualified, or they might not be, right? So you want to know the qualifications of the expert. You get some experts that are forensic experts that try to do valuation. You can impeach credibility just from their expertise. But in evaluation, it's challenging the assumptions. And there are quite a few assumptions that we're making in these valuations. So you want to challenge the assumptions, but you want to keep it to a point. Challenge the assumptions, but only the assumptions that materially affect the value. Like, I've been cross-examined on like a dozen things, most of which are irrelevant. And it just gets too much and it becomes a waste of time. Find the one or two things that really are going to adversely affect the result and hone in on that. and also focus on things that the valuation expert may have missed or not done. That's where I find I get the best cross against me, even though I shouldn't have done something, but it's like, hey, did you do A, B, C, D, and E? No, I did not. Okay, end it there. If I don't have a good redirect who says, you answered you didn't do A, B, C, D, and E, but did you have to do D, C, and E? No, I didn't have to, and here's why. But focusing on the things that were not done, like you didn't use a market approach in this, and you didn't tell me why. So there's 3 approaches, you only used 2. Focus on the things that were missed, focus on the things that are critical to the end result, and stay with those 2 things, and I think you'll be successful.
Okay, we are severely out of time. So thank you all for listening and hope you learned something.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everyone.